Okay, welcome everybody to Tech Tuesday number 56, where I'm going to try to present what a strategy is by giving you an example. But before we start, we still have 59 hostages, which we're waiting for them to come home. So we'll give a moment to think about them. One of the questions that we always talk about is what is IP strategy? Everybody wants to do IP strategy. We don't just want to file patents. And what I always say is that IP strategy has two parts. Part one is how the IP department, does what it does, spends its money, and so on. And the other one is strategy and how do you actually use the IP, and that's basically in the C-suite and in other places. But this doesn't really answer the question, and one of the reasons it doesn't is because strategy is a suitcase word. It means different things to different people. You can even find arguments, is strategy a thing or is it a process? So what I decided to do was, instead of getting into definitions, and I have lots of them, to walk through what the implementation of an IP strategy for a company might look like. And even though I'm going to talk now for more than 5 minutes, it's still going to be missing a lot of detail. What I am, so it's, more like a taste of what the IP strategy as implemented would look like. But what I will have quite a bit is I will be throughout, I'll talk about policy decisions, which are actually how strategy manifests itself in the company. Now, since I get to choose what the company is, I chose a company that believes that IP is important for its success, which means that it not only has an IP department, it also has a senior IP person, let's call it VP IP. And I'm not going to talk much about what happens inside the IP department because that's better known. So here's a company. The company is called Here and There. And what they specialize in, removing hairs. Now, any of you who have had hair removed by a cosmetic specialist knows that you have to come for multiple treatments because most treatments only work on hair follicles that are active at any given time. So you have to repeat it as more follicles wake up. And what's special about HAT is that they treat small areas and they do it in a single treatment. And the way they do it is they have a special chemical treatment which makes all of the hair follicles sensitive to, let's call it a mechanical treatment. And guess what? They filed patents, and more important, they also have an IP strategy, which means they have much more than just patents. So when we talk about IP strategy, and it's really how is IP going to be used, so what is it used for? It's used for the company. So let's ask, what is the company strategy? Roger L. Martin has a formulation for strategy, which he calls strategic choice cascade. And you have these 5 questions on the right. And if you answer these 5 questions, you kind of know what your strategy is. So let me just give you quickly the answers for HAT. The winning aspiration, they want to be the world leader in hair removal. Note, all hair removal. Where to play, where they going to be doing it? In small beauty clinics that serve mass markets. How is it going to win? by being the product leader and having continuous improvements, and the competitor won't be able to keep up with all of these improvements. Must have capabilities and management systems. We're going to see it later on. And just to be clear, we're talking about IP strategy for the company. We're not talking about IP strategy with the company as a product, and that needs its own special treatment, which we're not going to talk about today. In addition, this cascade, you notice, has little dotted arrows going in the opposite direction. That's because it's not one and done. You don't just answer these questions and you're done, but you have to continuously play around until you have a coherent answer. But I'm assuming that any company can describe its general strategy using this formulation. Now, the point of what I'm going to talk about today is that IP is relevant and it can help in each one of these things and more. We'll start with the easy part. The technological patent portfolio. This is not the entire patent portfolio, but basically we have patents on the following technological subjects. First of all, we have a drug which causes inflammation in dormant hair follicles. And when they get inflamed, they can be selectively heated and damaged so they don't grow hair. We have a heating protocol, which selectively damages follicles, but doesn't damage the other tissue. We have also a patent or patent family on a protocol which reduces the pain. Obviously, burning can cause pain. Our device has tips, so we have device tip geometries for different regions in the body. That's protected as well. We have a special smart tip, which has heating and drug delivery and monitoring. And we have software that evaluates the hairiness, I call them patient, and tracks what's going on. So we have patents on each one, and it's probably not a single patent, but a family of patents and so on. And really the core technology is we have a drug which makes hair follicles self-identify, and then we cook them. The problem is, to the sense it's a problem, it takes 40 minutes to do a treatment like this, because it's 20 minutes for the drug to have an effect and cause inflammation, and then it takes 20 minutes for the heating protocol to selectively damage those follicles. And what I want you to know is that these patents, they reflect a list of technical problems that HAT is aware of that need to be solved in order to build a working device. And this list is always getting updated, and that's why the portfolio is always getting updated. And of course, I didn't show you, but there's lists of patents for the future, which we're going to talk about a little bit. Now, I don't know if you noticed, but these patents cover things that are critical for HAT, but perhaps they're not critical for a competitor. HAT has a general policy, here we're starting with the IP strategy, to cover as many critical features and also important features, they're not critical, but they're important, as possible. Each one of the lines in the previous slide is usually a family of patents. And the reason why it's more than just one patent is because we want to have multiple layers of protection, and we want to have overlapping patents. And one of the reasons we do that is because, patents get used up. They get canceled, they get designed around, and by having multiple layers, you have some defense against it. Now, in case you were wondering, what you've seen so far is not an IP strategy. It's not even a whole IP portfolio. It's not even a whole patent portfolio. Okay, it's just part of it. But each item in the IP portfolio has a job that it's doing to further the interest of the company. This list of patents that I showed you might be part of what's called a critical feature denial strategy. meaning other people can't win in my way or play what I'm playing because they can't do these critical features. But Hat does other things as well using the IP portfolio, especially how to select where they're playing and how to make sure that only Hat can place it. I really wanted to talk about this later, but the fun part about IP strategy is that you do something and somebody else tries to do, and then you whack them on the head. So just to give you a feeling for it, Hat expects that the competition is going to avoid doing what we're doing because we have a good IP portfolio and because the competition really likes making money on these multi-treatment money streams. If you go to a practitioner and instead of having one treatment, you have to go for 5 treatments, that's 5 opportunities to do an upsell. Of course, what Hat is planning on doing is once they completely control this niche, they're going to leverage their market penetration in order to go into generalized hair removal. Hat is filing specific IP to prevent competitors from using their technology in single treatment protocols. And these patents are going to be hidden at the beginning so that people won't know what Hat wants to do. Hat also plans on educating the market. And really, if you notice, what I'm showing you is how business moves and IP strategy are working together. So Hat is going to educate the market. First, what are long 40-minute single treatments like? And after we build up these expectations, we're going to protect them using IP, in this case, both patents and branding. Okay, back to what's in the IP strategy. So some companies have a single key patent. If that patent is invalidated, there's no IP protection. Well, Hat has a policy of trying to avoid single point failures. And if you have a single point failure in general, there's different ways of dealing with it. One of them is monitoring, one of them is fixing your failure, one of them is buttressing, which is adding more layers, and another one is to hide the failure. And IP in Hat plays a part in all of them, but it can't do it by themselves. So IP function works together with a particular company function that Hat has, whose job it is to identify vulnerabilities. Now, when I talk about vulnerabilities and opportunities and strengths and risks, not only does a company have them, not only does the company strategy have them, not only does the IP strategy have them, but also specific IP items have them. I'm not going to cover all of the different possibilities, but let's look at a few examples. What's a vulnerability? That's a structural weakness of the company. You're always looking at it. For example, if our technology is built upon a particular unique drug, which it is, there's a vulnerability because new drugs may be discovered and then your IP doesn't have much value. And the solutions that Hat is using from an IP perspective is as much of the IP as possible. It doesn't care which drug it is that's being used to wake up the hair follicles. Risks are much more specific than vulnerabilities. And yes, there's a probability of something happening, but you have to remember your competitors are intelligent, so we're worried about them. Here's an example of a risk. In a country where the IP is weak, the courts don't do their job, so you have a competitor which might simply ignore your IP and copies it. And one of the solutions that Hat is using is using trade secret protection, particularly on how you match up the patient with the treatment, because even when you don't have good IP, good patents, or good courts, if competitor A doesn't know the trade secret, they can't copy. Here's something not everybody does, and maybe they shouldn't, but HAT maintains a list of potential design around risks. In other words, which patents can be designed around, which patents are at risk of being invalidated, where do we have freedom to operate risks, and solutions for each one of them. And of course, that list is a top secret document. Not all companies do that, and not all companies think it's a good idea, but HAT does. In general, when we talk about strengths and opportunities, so HAT's policy is to build on strengths to take over the market. And regarding opportunity, HAT encourages serendipity processes which help you discover opportunity. Now, HAT is completely aware that serendipity processes cost money or cost resources. For example, you might cause defocusing of what the company's doing. Everybody's too busy looking at opportunities. And one of the ways HAT deals with that, with this defocusing risk, is by having it separately from the rest of the company. In other words, the company does what the company does, and it has a separate unit which is looking for opportunities. In HAT, see at the bottom of the slide, identifying opportunities and supporting them is an IP function. So let me give you an example of how HAT deals with strength. The device is hands-free, it's 40 minutes, you don't touch it. And obviously, HAT has patents on it. And what it means is that HAT puts more effort into pushing this with marketing, but it does less work on improving the product with respect to how you hold it and how you manipulate it, which is good from an IP perspective because it reduces your risk of infringing somebody else's patent. Let's talk about opportunities. Small clinics are very sensitive if a worker doesn't come in, but HAT system requires fewer workers because you put it on, you wait 40 minutes and you take it off. And the way that we use IP to build on that is that we have IP, be it patents or trade secrets, I'm not going to go into detail, on how small clinics should operate. And of course, that's part of the marketing push as well. How do you acquire IP? So here's what HAT says. Regarding invention-driven innovation, meaning things that were invented by people and therefore you try to protect them, HAT believes in recognition, but not in giving any bonus. HAT believes that IP-related work is part of the team goals. Per team, once every 3 months, they go through each unit to find out what they invented. There's ongoing education about ideas and submissions, also problems. And when they decide, like in a patent committee, whether something's valuable or not, one of the filters is IP strategy. Second type of IP, which is common, is business-driven IP. So HAT does an IP design process every 6 months, where they try to figure out what IPs a company needs and see if they can obtain it. And of course, there's a checklist of considerations, which you can imagine what it is by the time we finish today. The C-suite is required to consider IP aspects of every major decision. I already said we have a VP IP, so it can be enforced. And there's an ongoing scouting for purchasing or licensing IP. And we'll talk about that a teeny bit later. IP creation. How is IP created? Well, one of the things that Hat believes in is the users, in other words, people in the clinics, are considered to be an R&D function of the company because they use a device and they come up with optimizations and so on, which means that we have agreements regarding who's allowed to publish and who owns new discoveries. In any case, the data is collected in a central manner. The agreements support Hat collecting that data, and Hat mines this data to identify insights in order to generate new IP. Now, just to be clear, this is all IP strategy, and how does Hat acquire new IP? Talk mainly about patents, but it's not only patents. Just briefly, trade secret strategy. So Hat's position on trade secret strategy is they use it to slow down competition, and they use it where IP rights are weak. We mentioned that. Specifically, they use technology trade secrets against people who want to copy them, and marketing trade secrets against people who are not copying them and try to get into the market. And that's it. There are other things you can do with trade secrets, but Hat doesn't do them. In addition, Hat believes in central recording and ranking and access control and all the right things you're supposed to do with trade secrets, and including ongoing education. And what Hat has that other companies often don't is that they have an external firm which evaluates how leaky Hat is, how many trade secrets escape unintentionally. Let's talk about design patents. Design patents are very cheap, and they're used by Hat for differentiation and support of the brand feel, the feeling you get from the brand. And in countries we're allowed to do it, we have a disposable element. The shape of the interconnect between the disposable element and the device, try to protect with design patents. In addition, there's a particular coordination with the industrial design unit, where since design patents are used to protect the differentiation in the field, we try to make sure that indeed we know what it is that gives this differentiation in field, and that these features are indeed protected. And we also use trademarks in order to strengthen the designs themselves. So as a general statement, Hat believes that the different types of IP should be working together, not separately. It's more complicated and more valuable. But there's lots of other types of IP, and I have a short list on the bottom, and none of those we're going to talk about. But Hat definitely does, of course. Budget. Okay. We all know that IP isn't free, and even IP policies are not free. So all of the policies that you see here today are based on some sort of, let's call it optimization or triaging. And I just want to be clear that these decisions are not based on numbers, 5 patents, 3 patents, and so on, but rather as a function that the IP does. In addition to just, IP costs money, one IP move can definitely contradict a different IP move. So when you see the different policies that we have here, that is taken into account the contradiction between different policies. Now, what's important here is that thinking about IP, IP is cheap, okay? You don't have to accept that, but IP is cheap. But thinking about IP is even cheaper. So Hat does a lot of thinking about IP. What about resources? So just for example, there's 300 engineer hours a month allocated for IP reasons. And the way they're broken down is 120 for portfolio management, like filing new applications, getting answers on office actions, and so on. 100 for IP-directed invention, meaning the IP department says that in order to do what the company wants, we have to invent something. and 80 for competitor analysis. You know, some companies believe that the engineers should not spend any time in competitor analysis, and here Hat believes that they should, and it's even budgeted. The IP budget also has parts in it which are defined in a way that relates the budget to, I call them goal levels. So the basic level of IP is IP, which is going to block most of Hat's competitors. 50% of the budget is in that direction. 25% of the budget is for blocking sophisticated competitors, and another 25% of the budget is for monetization opportunities. You don't have to agree with these numbers, but that's what Hat is doing. There's a general allowance, meaning it's kind of like an open budget for ATM type IP. What's an ATM type IP? That you can show a direct link between a particular piece of IP and revenue. If you can show, I'll file this trademark, make me money. I'll file this patent, it will make me money, you're going to get extra budget. And in addition, this is in general, but for specific company goals, you can get dedicated budget. That's how Hat does its IP budget. Strategy is usually a story. So here's a story for Hat. 2 years from now, it will have 25% of the small cosmeticians in the US and in East Asia. In 4 years, Hat will have enough penetration to get over 10% of the large area hair removal market. That's the general company story. And what you need to be aware of that at different stages, the company feels different, and also the IP that it needs is different at each stage. For example, IP for licensing, IP for preventing copycats, going to be different. And you also have events that you don't want them to happen. So you have IP to help prepare you for that. And one question which you need to answer and Hat has not answered yet is, how will IP help maintain this momentum and this story of here's what's going to happen in 2 years and here's what's going to happen in 4 years? If the company doesn't manage to keep momentum, the whole strategy could fall apart. Let's talk about adverse effect, competitors. So here's a great definition from somebody's book. What is strategic thinking? Outdoing an adversary, knowing the adversary is trying to do the same to you. Okay, and IP is a tool for doing that. And here's how Hat distinguishes their competitors, and it monitors their competitors, of course, also using IP in addition to the usual ways. So spoilers are competitors who just copy you, or even if they don't copy you, they cause the price in the market to go down. And as a general policy, IP in Hat is used to block the spoiler's ability to do these business activities. Monopolists want either to keep their market or to take over a market. And for each monopolist, Hat has a personalized mini strategy which combines business and IP. Colleagues is very interesting. It's companies that have a market share, 10%, 15%, just like Hat has. So we don't need to kill them. We'd love to make them smaller. And what we do is, in Hat, we have IP which we license to these colleagues. But hopefully we license in a way that we can pull the plug whenever we want. Strategics are companies that could either partner with Hat or compete with Hat. And Hat files personalized IP for each one of these strategics in order to force them to partner. And of course, there's competitors which are only going to come in the future. We have no idea where they are. And Hat has decided that 80% of its effort is on existing competitors we can identify, and 20% of the IP effort having to do with competitors is competitors which don't exist yet. So we're doing general solutions. In addition, once a year, the IP department has a competitor simulation game where they see what the competitor might do regarding IP. And of course, how do we get IP which is relevant to competitors? We analyze their business in order to identify where it would be useful to create IP or to refocus IP in a way which would cause, pain. Okay. Freedom to operate. What does HAT think about freedom to operate? HAT does triage. There's high risk, like competitors that want to kill you, or core technology. If you don't have freedom to operate on your core technology, it's not good. And here, HAT does in-depth searches and opinions, design arounds, opposes other people's patents, and so on. There's low risk, either because the people just want money or because the technology is changing. And here, HAT only does one freedom to operate analysis, maybe not even an opinion, maybe not a search, before launching. And in addition, for particular business events, it always considers freedom to operate. Also, a company policy not to update freedom to operate opinions once they're made. In addition, the HAT IP department tracks assertions and problematic IP, assertions of what you write in your opinion. We don't think we're infringing because we only remove black here. Okay? But the competitor or you might change to white here, and then the opinion is not useful anymore. In addition, once a year, there's an audit of the rights of others, your competitors and others. And what does that mean? Trade secrets, making sure you didn't steal anybody's trade secrets. Patents that you know of, especially the one which say we're not doing them. And IPs that other people have regarding risks, and our vulnerabilities are prioritized with regard to how much attention they get. Money. One of the reasons people file IP or should be filing IP is to support revenue generation, and maybe more important than generating the revenue is uninterrupted flow into HAT's bank account. Now, HAT has its model with a charge per disposable. Why? The disposable is in direct contact with a user, with a patient, for 20 or 40 minutes, and it's soft, so it's really difficult to sterilize. And HAT files patents on the disposables, and the patents were written in such a way that they poison alternative designs. People can't have a different design and get protection for it. And HAT also decided that the disposable is made non-trivial. It's not just a plastic bag or something like that. And of course, there's IP for it. Another problem with making money is that somebody can block you from making money, or somebody can siphon away some of your money. And HAT has as IP goals both to interfere with others' revenue and to take away some of the profit if possible. And I mentioned before considerations when, we file new IP. This is one of the considerations we do, and do unto others before they do unto you. When HAT files an application, it tries to be complete enough so nobody can file a later patent which will block you. And in particular, FTO analysis of critical parts of the revenue stream for HAT to make sure that somebody doesn't have a patent which would interfere with making money. I think you know that IP is not only for protecting, It's for other things. And I mentioned before that in HAT, each piece of IP has one or more specific use. By the way, looking cool is a use if you want it to be. At the very beginning, I gave you some ways that HAT is using IP, and I have a few other ways before. But one of the typical uses people use IP is to license. I mentioned before, we license to colleagues. HAT makes sure the IP is licensable to colleagues. If you have IP and you never assert it, you never tell people, don't infringe or you're infringing, give me money, the IP value can go down. So HAT has particular policy, plan, and how to assert the IP in order to make sure that the value is maintained and known. And of course, if you get any feedback, that goes to the IP prosecution department. Maybe you should be changing what you're doing with your patents. HAT also has an IP, a policy that they avoid litigation, except if there's a monopolist. Monopolist, it's okay to sue, you probably can't avoid it anyways. Once a year, the HAT reviews the IP portfolio to consider what they don't need to monetize. But even more important, they also ask which one of these patents could be leveraged. Last but not least, licensing in. If it's a non-critical technology, HAT believes in licensing it rather than developing it. But it also means that not only do you have to pay a license fee, you have to make sure you protect the trade secrets of others, and you have to decide who owns shared rights. So HAT has a policy on that. Market and ecosystem control. What HAT likes is that its competitors have difficulty finding suppliers. And the way HAT does it is a combination of trade secrets and patents. And here we're talking about the drug. HAT doesn't manufacture the drug. They make these little devices, stickers. But the way to make the drug is protected by trade secrets and by patents. And that makes it more difficult for a supplier to work with somebody else because they're always at risk of being sued. HAT also does not believe in indemnifying distributors. If they get sued for IP infringement, HAT doesn't care. Other companies do. HAT uses IP in order to structure the ecosystem and market. One of the ways they do it is they do a lot of publications about add-ons. They don't file patents, they just publish. That means that nobody can get a patent on these add-ons, which means that there can be a lot of companies making a small amount of income using their add-ons, but no big competitor can go in there. And regarding treatment protocols, HAT has an app store which encourages people to buy and sell protocols where HAT makes, 30%. If we're talking about marketing, we're talking about brands. So HAT believes that the patents and trade secrets and designs all support the brand, and the parts that do that come out of the branding budget. And in particular, I mentioned before, but it bears mentioning again, HAT uses IP to support the company positioning. Okay, and that means I don't want just to be different, I want to be far away from other people. That's what the company believes in, and the IP is, some of it is dedicated for that use. Geography is destiny. So most IP types are regional, and each region has its own needs. Why? Different market structure, different regulatory, different types of IP have different types of strengths. HAT divided it up into 3 markets, US, Europe, and East Asia, and also a little bit of developing. And they have different IP policies per market. And the budget is allocated according to how important the market is, rather than the bang for the buck, how much extra value this IP will give you in that market. When you talk about countries, even within a market, each country is different with respect to where it is in the acquisition stage. You have a potentially, I'm going to sell in Brazil. I've already started penetration selling in Argentina. I'm growing wildly in Mexico, and I want to extend from the US to a different market inside the US, a different product. Each one of these states has a different policy as well. But what's interesting, some companies believe that if you file a patent in one country, it will cause your competitors not to do something in another country. HAT doesn't believe in that. You want something in a country, you do it in that country. And in addition, HAT covers where the product is used rather than where it's manufactured or where you do R&D. And as a general policy, the ratio is 85, 10, 5. Okay, most of your patents are where it's used. What's left, 2/3 of where it's made, and only 5% where R&D is done. Different companies will do it differently. I call this outside the box, but it's not thinking outside the box. HAT uses the IP portfolio to reach beyond its current immediate relationships, which means that HAT thinks about ripple effects and protects them. HAT looks at the value chain, both upstream and downstream, relative to where they are. I mentioned before the IP design process. When HAT does IP design, they consider scenario generation and what's going to happen in each scenario. And HAT, as a policy, uses IP for non-standard uses. I mentioned it before, but for example, psychological effects, you want to attract talent, you want to build a relationship with the clinics by making the clinics feel like they invented something, their name is on the patent. That's part of the HAT IP policy. Now, IP management is a sophisticated, future-looking activity. And I have a quote from somewhere, and feel free to follow it. It's interesting. So I already said we're not going to talk much about what happens inside the IP department, but you definitely need regular audits which check that your IP activities actually follows the IP strategy, and that the strategy which you're following matches what the company needs. And of course, that this IP that you've created was actually used the way it should be. So at the very least, once a year, you present the IP state and strategy to the higher ups. Once every quarter, you meet with each department to see if IP is actually being used in whatever that department is doing. But of course, you're supposed to have clear relationships and ongoing activities with each department, especially the marketing department. And you have money for it. It's 2 hours per employee per year in order to generate an IP positive culture in the company. Maintaining and generating this culture is, of course, an IP function. If you have specific goals, you should have specific IP. Just as an example, HAT hopes to have an M&A with a company called Q-Ball, which, shave all the hair off your head. And that's why HAT files specific IP, which coordinates removing hair from your head with hair from your ears. I want to give you an example of a particular sub-goal that the IP department tracks and supports. You have a sub-manufacturer in Vietnam making disposables. You have particular trade secrets and patents over that sub-manufacturer to prevent them from moonlighting and making something for your competitors. Another specific goal is what happens if we get screwed. So 5% of the IP budget may be spent on patents whose main value is what happens if it starts raining. In addition, because you can't just get money because you want it, the IP budget is flexible, which means that at least 20% of the budget is easily liquidated, let's call it, if you suddenly need it for a big IP event like a litigation or an opportunity. If you're familiar with this book, The Seven Powers, it's about business strategy. The point is that people think that IP is a moat. So I'd like to correct that misconception. First of all, IP can be used to build a moat, not just to be the moat. And Hat believes, just like I do, that IP can be the moat, and it can also help you build a non-IP moat. And that's something that they think about whenever they're thinking about the IP strategy. Power is perhaps defined as controlling what other people want. And Hat believes in power on demand, which means that we use IP to create levers, and we don't apply these levers. We just have them, like beepers with explosive inside. But when we need, we apply them. And what it means is that the legal department has to make sure that it's whatever you're doing is allowed by law, covered by the contracts, and so on. And this is a tool that you give to the C-suite that when they need to apply to twist somebody's arm, they have a ready-made IP tool. In a more general sense, if you have a good IP position, it makes a company more flexibly able to deal with what is unknown or unexpected, which brings us to the next slide, which is about uncertainty. Now, if you notice, we talked about risk long before. I put this slide much later because uncertainty is not the same thing as risk. Risk means you can calculate what can go wrong and how bad it would be. Uncertainty means you don't even know. So Hat has a list of assumptions that might be wrong. And here's an example. And the IP is designed according to what can go bad. One of these assumptions can go. How do we do it in Hat? We have protection at different places in the, I called it world, but it's more like value chain. For example, if we have IP on the technology, on the user market, on the end customer, then if you lose patents on the technology, you still have patents on the other two places. It doesn't matter why you lose these patents. If the user market changes, you still have patents on technology. So Hat has this policy of spreading of IP bets. And also something which is useful to cap your downside, not your upside, but your downside, because being dead means that the company's not going to make any money. One more strategic consideration on the IP portfolio, sometimes the company runs out of money. One of the things that tends to die is the IP portfolio. The IP portfolio is designed so there's some sort of core, which is much cheaper than the rest of it. And I told you before, 50% or maybe even less, which gives you some value. What do you do about uncertainty? You have two options, three. One is to ignore it and then you break. One is to be robust, means you can withstand it. And one is to be anti-fragile. Hat believes in being robust. Surprising things happen and they don't matter too much to Hat. They're willing to spend up to 5% of the IP budget on helping the company, not the IP portfolio, but the company be anti-fragile. What I described before might have been, very spotlight focused, but I wanted to be clear that there's like very general policies for IP. How much do we invest in high-risk IP versus low-risk IP? 60-40. How much do we invest in the core business versus things that are somewhere out there? 85-15. How much do we spend on things that are short-term versus long-term risks? 50-50. Okay? Each company will have its own thing. I mentioned before, you're not allowed to have a single point of IP failure. At least you try to avoid it. Certain types of risk you simply ignore. And of course, when you talk about a risk and how well you're dealing with it, it's not a question of IP, but a complete answer, which includes IP and other company functions. The overall policy of the company, which I mentioned before, is to build on your strengths, but only after the weak is improved enough above some certain threshold. And, I've given you strategy, but I haven't given you the actual IP plan moving forward, because we know that there's going to be contradictions between these different allocations. So the actual IP plan is going to have to solve these contradictions. Let's do a reality check. Here's the major challenges of the company, so to speak. I selected a few. Here's a solution the company is using, and here is how IP is relevant to dealing with these challenges. A lot of people believe that strategy is about solving problems. Well, if it is, here's the problems. One of the problems is maintaining your competitive advantage, and HAT believes the solutions that they will use is continuous R&D. Well, it's pretty clear what we're going to do with IP. We're going to protect ourselves and make sure that we can use these new things that we develop. Another challenge is how to become a monopoly in single treatment. And what they want to do is being first and being very aggressive, which means we have to prevent copycats, because copycats are the easiest way of interfering with pricing. How do we make sure that our competitors don't know that we want to move into regular hair removal? So the solution of the company is going to emphasize that it's niche, it's a small area, and in general going to offer something which is incompatible with normal business. From an IP perspective, patent filings which prepare for HAT leaving the niche are going to be very low key. People won't, really realize how effective they are. In summary, IP strategy is about others and about the future. So if you do this again in 2 weeks, it might look different. And in fact, once a year there's a meeting to make sure it's going to look different. I gave you one way of looking at the IP and strategy implementation of a company. I don't have any fixed format. Obviously, I haven't showed you the whole thing. There's definitely more details that have to be. What I do want you to notice is all of these different choices that I made. How much on this, how much on that? We do this or we do that. Okay, if you don't have to make choices, then it's probably not a strategy. And more generally, a strategy is a choice between two smart ideas and not between a smart idea and a stupid idea. Any case, it's a strategy. Is it a good strategy? I don't know, but I gave you a link to somebody else who gives what they call an IP strategic plan. Now just imagine that you have to do exactly what I did for a different company. Okay, DIY me, they make software to guide do-it-yourself people. They want to move into selling kits. You can do exactly the same process. You fill out the cascade, you suggest some sort of narrative for what it is a company wants to do and when. Imagine some competitors. Now you have to decide what are the important IP issues. And if you have this amount of money and these number of people, what are you going to do? Okay, so I'm stopping the recording.